Hey guys, you're warm in bed, but inside your head, 1,000 generations of warriors are still sharpening their spears. What if I told you your ancestors had a 1 in 6 chance of dying by another human's hand? That's not on a battlefield, that's just what passed for natural causes back then. So how did we get from roasting meat by the fire to pressing buttons that could erase a city before your coffee cools? And why is the same species that can write love poems also the one that invented the bayonet, the guillotine, and the polite handshake before starting a war? If you enjoy slow, strange journeys through the darker corners of history, I'd love if you subscribed, but only if you genuinely like what I do here. Tonight, we're going to trace that story from the first blood-stained stone to the nuclear trigger and see whether we've truly tamed ourselves or just learned to hide the violence better. You're lying in bed, the thermostat doing its quiet, faithful job, your phone casting that familiar late-night glow. The biggest danger in the room is maybe dropping it on your face. You've earned this calm, but somewhere, deep in your chest, under all the years of board meetings, invoices, and just one more cup of coffee, there's a beat that doesn't belong to the 21st century. It's older, hungrier. That beat once thumped under a sky with no streetlights, just stars and whatever was growling in the dark. Back then, your security system was a rock in your hand and the hope you'd hear trouble before it heard you. You weren't thinking about quarterly returns. You were thinking about not being the evening special. And when another man came toward your waterhole, you didn't send an email. You sent a warning if you were feeling generous. Archaeologists have been kind enough to dig up the receipt skulls with neat fractures, ribs caved in, spear points lodged in places the owner would not have appreciated. These aren't accidents. No one tripped and fell into an obsidian blade. Long before we wrote down laws, we'd already mastered breaking each other. Violence wasn't the end of civilization, it was the prototype. And here's the punchline: your body still thinks that world is real. That twitch in your jaw when someone talks over you, that small rush of heat when a rival underbids you, your nervous system doesn't know the difference between losing a client and losing a mammoth. Same hardware, different battlefield. Our ancestors didn't survive because they were endlessly reasonable. They survived because, when the moment came, they were willing to put down the metaphorical coffee and pick up the literal club. Every innovation we admire, the first blade, the first fence, the first keep-out sign, wasn't a happy accident. It was a line in the sand. So yes, you're a builder, a negotiator, a man who prefers contracts to combat. But underneath the suit, you're still wired like the guy who once looked across a fire and thought, if he comes any closer, I'm keeping the meat. And maybe the unsettling part isn't that we've left that violence behind it, that it's still sitting there quietly, waiting for someone to make the first move. You've probably seen those heartwarming illustrations of early humans, everyone smiling around a campfire, sharing roasted meat like it's the prehistoric version of a tailgate party. Nice, isn't it cozy? Makes you think we were one big family until cities came along and spoiled everything. Yeah, about that. The dirt says otherwise. And by dirt, I mean archaeologists, the people who dig up the past and ruin whatever sentimental picture you had in your head. When they go poking around old riverbeds and lake shores, they don't find happy skeletons holding hands. They find heads cracked like dropped pottery, ribs like broken kindling, and sharp stone points still wedged exactly where the owner stopped appreciating them. Take Nataruk, modern-day Kenya. 10,000 years ago, it was home to a group of foragers, men, women, children just living their lives, looking for food, gossiping about whose fire smoked too much. And then another group showed up, not to trade recipes, not to swap fishing tips. They arrived with obsidian blades, clubs, and zero interest in being neighbourly. The end result: dozens of bodies left where they fell, skulls split so neatly you'd think someone was practicing for a butchery exam, ribs crushed as if hit by something heavier than bad luck. Some were bound, like prisoners. None were buried. This wasn't a fight. It was a massacre, the kind of message you send when you want your enemies to stop existing entirely. And judging by the fact that the victims didn't get up and complain, it worked. We like to imagine that violence is some byproduct of civilization, an unfortunate side effect of cities, taxes, and people who talk too loud in meetings. But the truth is, the first tools we made weren't for building shelters. They were for smashing things, sometimes dinner, sometimes each other. The oldest stone tools date back over 2.5 million years. They're not elegant, they're not symmetrical, they're not the sort of thing you display in your foyer to impress guests. They are sharp, heavy, and designed for one thing, turning something alive into something that isn't. And yes, before you protest, they were used to butcher animals, but every now and then, the bones on the ground looked suspiciously human. Cut marks on shin bones, skulls with neat puncture wounds. You don't get those from tripping over a log. The problem is, we keep romanticizing the past. We picture small, scrappy bands of hunter-gatherers sharing meat, swapping stories, and living in harmony because they didn't have much. We forget that not having much is also the perfect recipe for wanting what someone else has, and when the thing they had was food, water, or even just the good campsite with less wind, the conversation could turn from let's work this out to let's see whose skull cracks first in record time. Violence, it turns out, didn't start when we built kingdoms. It started before pottery, before agriculture, before anyone even thought about writing down a threat. It may even be older than our species. The choice to strike first, that little flicker of calculation, was part of the survival kit, and in a world without contracts or police, it was remarkably effective. Imagine two small groups meeting at a river. One group is stronger, faster, or simply meaner. The other is tired, distracted, maybe still digesting breakfast, who walks away with the water and whose kids live long enough to pass on their genes. It's ugly, but it's math. The survivors weren't always the nicest. They were the ones who didn't wait to be attacked. And here's the twist: the very act of making and using weapons may have made us smarter. Learning to chip a stone into a cutting edge takes planning. Using it takes coordination. Passing that skill along takes teaching. So the first time one of your ancestors picked up a rock and thought, "This will split a rib cage nicely," they were also paving the way for complex thought, cooperation, and thousands of years later, the ability to make inspirational PowerPoints. But innovation didn't make things gentler. If anything, it made them bloodier. Hunting large animals meant driving entire herds off cliffs. Not one or two animals, hundreds. Bones shattering on impact, carcasses piling at the bottom. The efficiency was impressive. The cleanup, not so much. And then there was cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism. Some ancient human remains show clear signs of being butchered just like game animals, cut marks on bones, marrow extracted, skulls split for access to the good stuff inside. Was it ritual nutrition desperation? Maybe all three, whatever the reason. It was violence taken to its logical extreme. Not only do you remove your rival from the equation, you add them to the menu. Of course, even in the middle of all this, we weren't entirely heartless. Archaeologists have found skeletons with injuries that had healed long before death, broken legs that knitted, skull fractures that closed, which means someone helped, someone shared food, stood guard, waited out the healing. The same hands that sharpened spears also bound wounds. The killers were also the caretakers, but when the caretakers weren't needed, the spears came back out. That's the contradiction baked into our DNA. The instinct to protect and the instinct to destroy errant opposites. They're roommates, and they've been splitting the rent since long before history started keeping receipts. So, yes, there was art too. Red ochre pigments for body paint, beads and shells for decoration, maybe even the first attempts at storytelling. But picture those same painted hands wrapped around a club. Imagine the shell necklace bouncing as its owner sprints into a fight. Beauty and brutality weren't separate roads. They were lanes on the same track, often used on the same day. And here's the takeaway nobody likes to admit: the people you come from weren't just survivors. They were strategic, efficient, sometimes cruel, and they were very, very good at it. You inherited their reflexes, their instincts, their knack for knowing when to wait and when to swing. You've just traded riverbanks for conference rooms, spears for contracts, ambushes for mergers. The game is the same. The tools are prettier. Next time you're holding a smooth stone in your hand, remember it's the ancestor of every weapon ever made. In the long story of humanity, it was the first whisper of everything that would follow. And it wasn't whispered over a campfire in peace. It was whispered over someone's shoulder, just before the blow landed. You learn a lot about species by watching what it does when the sun goes down. For us, night was inventory time. Count the surviving fingers, patch the holes in the skin, argue about who burned the meat, and lean into the one miracle we could control fire. The flame was heat, yes, and light, sure, but more than that, it was a stage. Shadows made a wall, the world got smaller, and inside that circle we became something new. Planners, storytellers, and when necessary, liars. The motif never changed. The shadow of the fire hides the hand holding the stone. You can toast that on a flat rock if you like. Fire gave us the first boardroom. Around it, the day's chaos became the plan. We assigned roles, you flank left, ill spook the herd. Someone braver will pretend not to be terrified and run straight at the thing with horns. Cooperative hunting is a polite way of saying group project with sharp objects, and like every group project, there were free riders, quiet heroes, and a guy who insisted on circle back even when the circle contained a mammoth. The minutes of the meeting were not taken. They were remembered in muscle memory and scars. Then came the hunt bodies moving like one mind, hands signalling, feet whispering to the dirt. We were magnificent when we worked together. We forgot ourselves. The herd panicked. The earth thundered, and for a short, bright stretch of seconds, we were a single animal with many hands. That's the part of our ancestry you like to picture: the crisp execution, the perfect timing, the triumphant haul. The after-party at the cliff's edge was less glamorous: broken legs, broken tools, breath that tasted like metal. But dinner is dinner, even if gravity did most of the cooking. Back at the fire, the mood flipped. We became artists. Someone dragged a red line of ochre across a rock, marking a flank and a trajectory. Here the spear goes. Another traced a hand, a human barcode in negative. Someone else sang, and the rhythm stitched loose nerves back together like thread through hide. Call it culture, call it decompression. The point is, the same hands that had just driven a ton of meat off a cliff could also make a line that still stops your breath 30,000 years later. Creation sat right next to destruction on the log, sharing the same smoke. And then the part you don't want to picture: the meeting after the meeting. The shadows shifted, the circle tightened, and the conversation wasn't about bison anymore. It was about him, yes. Him, the one who took the best marrow, who misplaced a blade that wasn't his, who kept showing up late to the ambush with reasons that sounded suspiciously like excuses. How do you handle performance management when HR is just a larger rock? Quietly, decisively. In the morning, when the herd moved, someone else carried the spear. That's the contradiction we inherited. By day, the group was everything. You risked your life for the person sprinting at your shoulder. At night, the ledger came out in someone's head, and the math got personal. Share, build, teaches, but also guard, exclude, punish. The survival kit came with both instructions stapled together. If you ever wonder why modern teams can launch a product on Friday and be at each other's throats by Monday, congratulations, you've discovered our factory settings. Toolmaking sharpened the paradox. There's romance in the word napper, less romance in the reality hours of flint, bleeding thumbs, and the soothing sound of your friend saying almost for the 20th time. Still, the first time a flake split clean and wicked, you felt the future open like a seam. A better edge meant a cleaner cut, a faster quartering, fewer hours in the open with your back saying things your mouth couldn't. Progress felt like mercy until the edge slid neatly between ribs you hadn't planned to pierce. Same edge, different afternoon. The rock didn't care. We built fences. Toot first, just habits. We sleep here, you sleep there. Then rules. Don't touch the meat until the elder says so. Then decorations that also meant keep out. A ring of bones, a row of skulls, a pile of antlers that started as art and ended as a thesis. People call that proto-religion now. We might call it branding. Either way, the message was clear in any language: this is ours because we say it is, and we can say it louder if necessary. Before you decide, we were savages with jewellery. Note the tenderness in the archaeological ledger. Legs that healed straight because someone carried the weight. Jaws that mended because someone mashed food and fed it patiently. Spines that fused after disaster because someone said, stay. We didn't just fight together. We suffered together. Every scar we survived taught the next hunt how not to break. There's your R&D department, a row of people who refused to leave each other behind, even when leaving would have been cheaper. But tenderness had an expiration date. Food runs thin, the river shrinks, tempers get brittle. The same men who harmonized over a kill turned staccato when a stranger's shadow appeared on the ridge. Did we negotiate sometimes? Did we posture? Absolutely. Did we smile and stall while someone drifted wide into the grass with a club? Well, let's just say the phrase win-win hadn't been invented, but the concept of we win, you disappear had strong traction. The fire hit the hand, and the hand did what the day would not forgive, but the night would forget. The art tells on us. Look long enough at the painted walls and you see more than animals. You see grids, lines, arrows, a rehearsal scribbled in pigment. You see dancers with masks who might be spirits, or might be the first ergonomics experiment feet practicing panic before it happens. Beauty wasn't a vacation from violence. Beauty was training, a way to practice courage when the only audience was firelight and the only critic was fear. Burials tell on us too. Bodies tucked carefully with ochre and beads, the dead arranged as if sleeping on purpose. We grieved. We planned for them. We tried to fold meaning around absence like a blanket against cold. And sometimes, just beyond the neat grave, there is a body that wasn't tucked at all face down. Wrong angle, wrong place, no ceremony, no witnesses. Both are us, the saint and the quiet shove, the lullaby and the sudden silence. Our ancestors didn't split the difference. They carried the whole contradiction like a hot coal. If you need a modern translation, think about the last time you were in a negotiation that felt collaborative right up to the moment it didn't. Everyone aligned, charts smooth, coffee warmed, then a sentence you didn't expect landed just a little too clean. You felt it under the ribs first. Your ancestors nod from across the millennia. The venue has nicer chairs. The old choreography remains. We like to say necessity is the mother of invention. But fear is the father who pays for the lessons and insists on drills. Fire taught us to see each other. Fear taught us to edit the circle. We invented lullabies so children could sleep and sentries so adults wouldn't. We made knives sharp enough to cut hide and dull enough on purpose at a bruise without breaking the tool. The duality wasn't an accident. It was a design requirement. Build a world good enough to live in and a guard good enough to keep it from being stolen. There's a temptation, especially when the thermostat is steady and the news can be scrolled past, to declare the paradox obsolete. We have contracts, traffic laws, customer service, but look closely at any tight-knit team under pressure. The jokes get drier, the eyes get sharper. The fire-led now still makes a wall. Somebody starts saying we are lot, and somebody else hears not you. It's not evil, it's geometry. Circles include and exclude by definition. So here's what the fire showed us, and still shows if you're willing to stare into it long enough. We are animals of the we and they, share and strike, bless and bury. The hand that draws the antelope in perfect motion is the hand that steadies the wrist before the throw. The song that keeps the group together is the drumbeat that shakes someone apart. Our greatness was not that we escaped the contradiction, but that we used it. We took the edge that could end a life and used it to shape a wheel, a roof, a word. Then, when night fell and the wind argued at the door, we put the edge within reach and slept anyway. If that makes you uneasy, good. Uneasy is honest. You come from people who could make a shelter out of bones and a warning out of feathers, who could teach a child to laugh and teach him, gently, where to stand when trouble comes. You carry their careful eyes, their quick math, their talent for pretending the worst will not happen while quietly preparing for the afternoon it does. It is not a flaw, it is a legacy. The flame drops lower, the circle breathes. Somewhere out beyond the light, something moves. Or doesn't your ear's vote does? Because ancient ears are unionized against optimism. Inside, someone adds a stick, someone slices meat, someone hums the song that says we belong. In that same moment, somebody else palms a stone, not to use, not yet, just to know it's there. We created art so we wouldn't forget who we could be. We kept the rock so we wouldn't forget who we are. They say blood is thicker than water. That might be true, but claws are thicker than both. If you ever start feeling smug about being human, about our art, our ethics, our belief in customer service, spend some time watching our extended family, the primates. They'll cure you of that superiority complex in an afternoon. Start with chimpanzees. They look cute enough when they're sitting in the grass, peeling fruit like retirees at a picnic. But when the mood shifts, it shifts hard. A patrol of males will slip into a neighbouring troop's territory, moving quiet as debt collectors. They're not looking for a fair fight. They're looking for an opportunity on an unlucky male alone. Maybe distracted. Maybe thinking about lunch. They hit fast and without ceremony. targeting the face, the throat, the genitals, places evolution teaches you to protect for a reason. When it's done, there's no gloating, no war dance. They just leave the body and head home, as calm as if they'd taken out the recycling. This isn't random aggression, it's strategy. Fewer rival males means more food for their group. More food means more females. More females means more babies who carry their genes. It's a simple business plan, executed without paperwork. If chimps wore ties, you'd call them ruthless executives. They just happen to measure quarterly success in territory gained and enemies removed. And it's not just chimps. Gorillas big, stoic. Vegetarian giants aren't strangers to violence either, especially when two silverbacks decide there's only room for one CEO. These clashes are less about subtlety and more about shock and awe, chest beating so loud you feel it in your own ribcage, charging runs, and, if nobody backs down, a blunt force brawl that would make a hockey fight look like a handshake. The prize isn't just leadership, it's mating rights, which in guerrilla economics is the only currency that matters. And yes, sometimes the new boss kills the infants of the old boss-a-hostile takeover in the most literal sense. The logic, if she's not nursing, she's ready to breed again. Cold, absolutely. Effective. Also, yes. Then there's our other close cousin, the bonobo. Same genus as chimps, radically different management style. When bonobos feel tension rising, they don't form raiding parties or beat their chests. They socialize. Intensely. Extensively. In ways that would get your workplace training department involved. Disputes over food, dominance, or who sat in whose spot are often resolved not with teeth or fists, but with sudden bursts of intimate contact. Anthropologists call them the make-love, not war apes, though given how often they do it, make-love might be their war. The result, bonobo societies are generally more peaceful than chimpanzee societies, but don't mistake that for sainthood, they'll still bite when they have to. They just prefer other tactics first. So here's your biological mirror, even among our closest relatives. Violence isn't a human invention. It's a survival strategy. Different species use different playbooks, but the goal is the same: maximize resources, minimize threats, pass on the family brand, and then, of course, we had to go and make it complicated. Early humans didn't just have neighbouring troops. We had neighbouring species: Homo erectus, Denisovans, Neanderthals. They weren't characters in some ancient dinner party. They were competition, and not the kind you quietly underbid. These were smart, strong, adaptable hominins with tools, fire, and the same look in their eyes you get when someone is about to take the last parking space you've been waiting for. Neanderthals in particular were a problem and a temptation, stockier than us, built for cold like living snowplows. They could take a punch and probably deliver one through a tree trunk. For decades we painted them as brutes, lumbering around with clubs, grunting at rocks. Now we know they buried their dead, made jewellery, painted caves, and maybe even played musical instruments. In other words, they were us just differently configured, and yet, here we are. They aren't. The fossil record hints at contact-shared genes from interbreeding, sure, but also injuries that look suspiciously like the kind you get from being on the wrong end of a tool. Did we wipe them out? Did climate finish the job? Or was it just the slow arithmetic of two predators chasing the same prey in the same valley? It's not hard to imagine the meetings, both species eyeing the same herd of reindeer, both planning the same ambush. Somebody moves first. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe it's not. And once blood is spilled, you've got a cycle. Ask any chimp patrol how those end. And because humans are humans, we probably added theatrics. The first time a Homo sapiens took a Neanderthal's territory, maybe he left something behind, a broken spear point in the doorway, a smear of ochre on the wall, branding, again. Let the survivors know who to thank for their new, smaller world. If this sounds grim, remember it's not unique to us. Male chimps expand territory by killing rivals. Male gorillas maintain power by removing potential competitors before they can grow up to challenge them. Bonobos keep the peace by constantly reinforcing bonds, sometimes awkwardly often. The difference is, we combined all three strategies. We could raid, we could remove, and we could bond in complex, politically useful ways. It made us flexible. It also made us dangerous in ways no other primate has matched. The violence in our lineage isn't random. It's targeted, intentional, and often chillingly efficient. Our relatives show us the building blocks coordinated attacks, intimidation displays, strategic alliances. We just took those blocks and built skyscrapers. And then we learned to drop them on people. Here's the part that's worth sitting with: we didn't leave those instincts behind. Watch a negotiation between rival executives and you'll see the chimp patrol quiet, deliberate, searching for the weakest flank. Watch a political campaign and you'll see the silverbacks loud, imposing, chest out, making sure everyone hears the thump. Watch any online flame war and you'll see the bonobo swell. Maybe don't watch too closely. The methods have shifted. The animal logic hasn't. It's tempting to think civilization erased the animal in us. But civilization is just a new kind of jungle one, with better lighting and more paperwork. The territorial lines are still there. They're just drawn in market share and public opinion instead of dirt. We still measure strength in allies and resources. We still remove threats when we can, and when we can't, we find other ways to neutralize them, sometimes with a handshake, sometimes with a merger, sometimes with something a little sharper. So when you look at the chimps, the gorillas, the bonobos, you're not just looking at cousins, you're looking at mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of the same survival game. We share blood, but the claws are different shapes. They use theirs in the forest. We use ours in courtrooms, newsrooms, and boardrooms. Different habitats, same rules. And maybe that's why it still feels so natural to form alliances, to guard turf, to test boundaries. You're not just playing the human game, you're playing the primate game. The one that started long before we carved our first spear. It's not a flaw, it's the system. And like any system, you can work within it, bend it, maybe even improve it, but you'll never be entirely outside it. Because deep down, you still know the rules. Don't wander alone where you don't belong. Don't show weakness in a dispute. And never ever forget that the quiet relative peeling fruit might also know exactly how to break your skull when it matters. We've all seen it before. It runs in the family. The first time we met them, it probably wasn't polite. They weren't strangers in the abstract. They were the kind of strangers who already knew your hunting routes, who could smell your fires before you could smell theirs. Neanderthals, broad-shouldered, cold-weather specialists, built like snowplows with opinions. They had the same hands we did, the same knack for turning a rock into a tool, the same idea about a good piece of shelter. Which is to say, they had all the makings of excellent neighbours and all the ingredients for the worst kind of rivals. At first, there may have been curiosity. You see someone across the valley who looks almost like you, just thicker. Maybe you trade a glance, a gesture, maybe even a gift, a piece of flint, a strip of dried meat. The icebreaker goes well enough, and then, inevitably, someone notices that the deer herds have been smaller lately. Someone's footprints are showing up on both sides of the ridge. Someone's tools look suspiciously like the ones that went missing last month. Suddenly, the novelty wears off. The fossil record doesn't give us transcripts, but it gives us headlines: fractured skulls, spear points lodged in vertebrae, bones with cut marks that weren't made by accident. The first war between humans wasn't humans on both sides, it was us and them. Sapiens and Neanderthals, cousins who didn't survive family dinner. It's tempting to paint it as an extermination campaign, like we set out from Africa with kill all Neanderthals carved into our travel plans. But reality is probably messier. Two top predators competing for the same patch of ground will eventually find themselves in each other's way. It might start with a stolen carcass, escalate to a nighttime raid, and end with a valley that changes hands. Multiply that by dozens of valleys over thousands of years, and the map starts to look different. And here's where the motif comes in. We win, but not without loss. Because we didn't walk away unscathed. Neanderthals hit hard. A single silver-haired one could probably knock the air out of you before you got your spear halfway up. Their bones show they survived injuries that would have sent us into permanent retirement. This was not prey, this was an opponent, and they were good, so why did we outlast them? Maybe it was numbers we bred faster. Maybe it was networks, we had better gossip and wider alliances. Maybe it was just dumb luck, a bad winter here, a failed hunt there, until their population was too small to bounce back. Or maybe we were just willing to take risks they weren't. That's the ugly side of survival. It doesn't reward the most noble, it rewards the most adaptable, the most persistent, the ones willing to try a new tactic even if it makes the elders shake their heads. And we did try new tactics. Coordinated hunts, longer range weapons, planning raids at dawn when the light favoured us. We learned to make alliances beyond the immediate family group, to coordinate over distances. That was our edge. Neanderthals were brilliant at surviving in small, tight groups. We figured out how to scale. Think of it as the first merger hostile, of course. But here's the thing about winning it doesn't mean you stop carrying the weight of the fight. Some of them didn't disappear into the dark. Some disappeared into us. Their DNA is in ours. A few percentage points of their story spliced into ours. We fought them, and we bred with them. And in a way, that's the most human outcome imaginable. Kill the competition, but keep the parts you like. It's hard not to feel a grim pride in that. We weren't just stronger or smarter, we were stubborn, inventive, and, when the situation called for it, dangerous enough to change the shape of our own family tree. That's the part of the story you can toast around a fire. We were tested, and we endured, but there's loss there too. They weren't just enemies. They were the only other species that could look at us and see something familiar. The same way a wolf might look at another wolf across the snow and recognize a pattern in the gait, a sharpness in the eyes. When they were gone, we were alone in a way we had never been before. No one else out there who could challenge us in quite the same way. And what do you do when you're the only apex predator in the room? You start looking inward. You start noticing that the other sapiens over the hill are hunting your herd, fishing your stream, and the habits you honed against Neanderthals' watchfulness. Swift retaliation, coordinated strikes well. Those adapt nicely to human vs human conflict. You could argue the first war set the template for every war that followed. That's the bittersweet inheritance, the knowledge that survival sometimes means removing the competition entirely. And the experience of having done it once already. We proved we could win. We also proved we were willing to pay the price. And once you've accepted that cost, the threshold for paying it again gets lower. It's worth imagining that final chapter, a Neanderthal settlement on a ridge, fires glowing against the cold, unaware or maybe fully aware that another group is approaching through the snow. Quiet steps, spear points ready, not a battle cry, not an announcement, just the soft, inevitable collision of two ways of being that can't share the same space. In the morning, the valley belongs to one side. The victors will tell the story in a way that makes sense to them. We were cleverer, faster, more united. The truth might be simpler. We were still standing, and in the cold calculus of survival. That's all that matters. The bones in the ground don't care. They don't tell us who struck first, or whether there were handshakes once upon a time. They just tell us there was contact, and then there wasn't. And somewhere in your blood is the echo of that winter, a reminder that you come from people who saw the choice clearly and made it. So yes, we won, but not without loss. They're gone, and we carry their shadows with us, along with their cheekbones and immune system quirks. When you feel that flicker of both pride and something you can't quite name, that's them. That's the memory of the first war, and like every war since, it left us changed in ways we'll never fully undo. For most of human history, home was wherever your feet stopped moving. You ate what you could find, you slept where you didn't freeze, and when the seasons shifted, so did you. No fixed address, no property taxes, no neighbours to complain about the smoke from your fire. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the conflict small and mobile. If another group wandered too close, you could usually just keep walking. Then somebody planted a seed. It must have seemed harmless. You drop a few grains, wait a season, and miracle, you don't have to chase dinner anymore. The earth starts working for you. One season turns into two into a lifetime, and before you know it, you've gone from wanderer to homeowner. You've got fields, storage pits, a herd of animals that don't run away when you get close. You've got, for the first time, something worth defending, and that's the catch. A campsite is temporary. A field of barley is a billboard that says, "Here I am. Please consider taking my stuff." The first house was also the first open for business sign for conflict. It didn't take long for the logic to spread. If food comes from this patch of dirt, and this patch of dirt is mine, then anyone on it without my permission is a threat. And if I've got good land, then someone else has bad land and they're going to notice. You can see the escalation. First come the polite warnings, then the not so polite warnings, then the part where you sharpen the farming tools and realize they make excellent weapons. Farming changed the rhythm of life in other ways too. Hunter-gatherers could survive lean times by moving on. Farmers couldn't. When the crops failed, you didn't have the option to pick up your life and go. Your life was in the ground, and you were chained to it by rows of plants and walls of mud. Desperation makes people inventive, and inventive often means figuring out how to take from the guy whose granary is full That's how we got the first siege of small ones at first. A neighbouring village shows up at night to borrow some of your grain, and you have to explain that borrowing doesn't involve tying up the guards, so you post more guards, build a fence, make the fence higher, replace the fence with a wall, and while you're at it, dig a ditch in front. Congratulations, you've invented fortifications, which is just the polite word for, please die somewhere else. Walls changed everything. Before, you could see your neighbours and wave. Now you saw the top of their wall, maybe a spear point sticking out, and you wondered what they were hiding. Walls don't just keep people out, they make the people inside more suspicious, more certain that the world out there is hostile, which, of course, makes the world out there more hostile in return. This is where the motif kicks in. A house is an invitation to enemies. A walled settlement is a challenge. It says, we have enough to protect, which makes other people think. You must have enough to steal. And once you have walls, you need more than farmers. You need fighters men whose only job is to make sure the walls still mean something. That's the birth of the professional soldier, paid in food instead of coin, guarding the harvest like it's gold. And agriculture didn't just create enemies between villages, it created hierarchies inside them. Some people owned more land than others. Some controlled the water, the seed, the tools. The guy who figured out irrigation wasn't just helping the community. He was creating a lever to move the whole social order. And levers are dangerous in the wrong hands or in any hands. Really. Suddenly, disputes weren't just about who hunted which deer. They were about taxes, quotas, and whether the chief's cousin really needed that much grain for religious purposes. Of course, religion got involved. Fertility gods, harvest gods, rain gods, they all got temples, and temples got grain, and grain meant power. Soon the people who could talk to the gods were the same people who could decide whether you ate this winter. And if your neighbour's gods seemed to be doing a better job than yours, well, maybe it was time to pay them a visit and borrow their god, and their grain, and their land. The thing about farming is it makes you think in seasons, not days. That's good for planning crops. It's also good for planning revenge. A slight in the spring could wait until harvest to settle, when your enemy fields were ripe for burning and their men were busy reaping instead of guarding. Raiding became a calendar event. You didn't just fight when you were angry, you fought when it was most efficient. And once you start thinking like that, you're not a farmer anymore, you're a strategist with dirt under your nails. It's easy to romanticize the shift to agriculture, more food, bigger populations, permanent homes, but baked into that stability was a constant low-grade war. Every wall was a bet against your neighbour's goodwill. Every field was a reminder that resources were finite and location was destiny. And every harvest was an opportunity not just for you, but for everyone who could reach your gate. The archaeological record backs this up. Mass graves from early farming communities show wounds from weapons, not hunting accidents. Fortified settlements pop up in the record alongside evidence of raids burn layers, smashed storage jars, arrowheads lodged in bones. These weren't random disasters. They were campaigns, planned and executed with the same attention you'd give to planting season. And when a raid succeeded, the victors didn't just take food, they took people, slaves to work the fields, to build more walls, to make more food to defend, which in turn required more walls, more guards, and, inevitably, more fights. It's the oldest feedback loop in the book. Security breeds prosperity. Prosperity breeds envy. Envy breeds conflict, and conflict sends you back to building bigger walls. If you think we've grown out of that, look at modern cities. We've traded stone walls for borders, fences, and locked doors. We've traded granaries for banks, fields for factories, but the logic hasn't changed. A full warehouse is just a granary and a suit, and a border dispute over farmland is just a neighbourhood feud with higher stakes. The irony is, farming was supposed to make life easier, and in a way, it did. You had bread instead of berries, beer instead of river water, a roof instead of a cave. But you also had a to-do list that included check the walls and make sure the neighbour's son isn't sneaking into the grain store. Comfort came with a constant background hum of threat. And maybe that's the deeper truth. Stability doesn't erase conflict. It concentrates it. It draws lines on the map where before there was only open space. It turns survival from a moving target into a fixed point that everyone can see and aim for. The first seed planted was the first anchor dropped. It held you in place. And once you were in place, The world knew exactly where to find you. Civilization likes to tell itself that laws are about fairness. That's the marketing copy. The reality is simpler laws are about control. And in the beginning, they didn't hide it. Take Hammurabi's Code, carved neatly into stone around 1750 BCE. It's one of the oldest known legal systems, and it reads like the fine print of a very aggressive contract. Some rules are practical: how to settle debts, what to pay if your ox wanders into someone else's field. Others are more direct. If a builder puts up a house and it collapses and kills the owner, kill the builder. Straightforward. No appeals, customer satisfaction guaranteed, or your money and your life back. This was the genius of early law. It took the chaos of personal vengeance and outsourced it to the state. Before, if someone wronged you, you might gather a few relatives, sharpen some blades, and see what happened. Now, you could take it to the authorities. They'd handle it for you with equally sharp blades, but under the comforting banner of justice, and the blood still ran. It just ran on schedule. The motif fits perfectly here. Law was a stick wrapped in velvet. The velvet was the promise of order, of rules everyone could see. The stick was the fact that breaking those rules often got you killed slowly. If the crowd had paid for tickets, laws didn't eliminate violence. They standardized it, branded it, and made sure it served the people in charge. And those people understood something important: violence, when it's messy and unpredictable, frightens everyone. Violence, when it's ritualized, frightens the right people. Public executions became theatre, beheadings, floggings, crucifixions, each with its own choreography, symbolism, and front row seating. The point wasn't just to punish the guilty. It was to remind the innocent of exactly where the line was. In some places, the punishments were tailored for maximum impact. In ancient Persia, nobles might be executed privately to spare their families shame, while commoners were dispatched in ways that drew a crowd. In Rome, certain crimes earned you a date in the arena, where your last moments doubled as someone else's afternoon entertainment. The audience went home with a story. The state went home with proof it could end you at will. Religion often partnered in this arrangement. If the king ruled by divine mandate, then breaking his laws wasn't just a civic offense, it was a spiritual one. Punishment became purification. Burn the heretic, stone the blasphemer, sacrifice the criminal at the temple steps. The gods, conveniently, always seemed to want the same people removed as the rulers did. By wrapping violence in law, society solved a few problems. Personal vendettas didn't spiral into endless feuds, at least. Not as often. The threat of punishment discouraged some crimes, or at least pushed them into darker corners, and the spectacle kept the public invested. You might not love the king, but you probably loved watching a thief get what was coming to him, especially if you were in the mood for a festival. But this system also had an obvious flaw: the law served the lawmakers. If you were rich, powerful, or related to someone with a seal and a scribe, the stick hit more softly or not at all. Penalties were often scaled to status. In some Mesopotamian laws, injuring a noble cost you more than injuring a commoner. In others, the death penalty applied to peasants for crimes that earned nobles a fine. Justice wore velvet, but it wasn't the same fabric for everyone, and yet people bought into it. Not because they were naive, but because even biased order was better than no order. The farmer whose neighbour stole his grain might know the judge favoured the neighbour's clan, but the judge's verdict still set a precedent. It still made the thief think twice next time, and when the punishment was carried out in the town square, everyone saw the cost of stepping out of line. Execution methods themselves were a kind of branding. The guillotine in revolutionary France was marketed as humane and egalitarian. Every condemned person, noble or peasant, died the same way. In reality, it was also efficient. You could work through a backlog of dissenters before lunch. Hanging was cheaper, burning more dramatic, crucifixion slower and more humiliating. The state chose the method that fit the message. In some cultures, even mercy was weaponized. A ruler might spare a criminal at the last moment, turning an execution into a spectacle of magnanimity. The crowd would cheer, the condemned would swear loyalty, and the ruler's reputation for both power and benevolence would grow. Mercy, in these cases, was just another form of control proof. The stick could be lowered as well as swung. Ritual killings and legal executions also blurred together in ways that made the distinction almost meaningless. Sacrifices to the gods might double as political purges. Religious trials could end with punishments indistinguishable from civic ones. Whether the justification was divine will or statutory law, the outcome was the same: someone bled, and someone else's authority was reinforced. Over time, the process became so normalized that it almost disappeared into the background. A sentencing here, a flogging there, the occasional mass execution after a rebellion. It was part of the civic calendar, like harvest festivals or tax collection. The machinery of violence ran so smoothly that most people didn't see it as violence anymore. It was just the law doing its job. That normalization was the real achievement, a populace that sees executions as entertainment or as the inevitable price of stability, and is unlikely to challenge the system. They'll grumble about taxes, curse corrupt officials, maybe even riot over bread, but the idea that the state has the right to end a life becomes unquestionable. And once that's accepted, the rest is just paperwork. If there's a modern echo of this, it's in how we sanitize force. We don't hold public executions in the square anymore, but we do accept that some people vanish into prisons for decades, that wars are waged far from home, that collateral damage is an unfortunate but unavoidable cost. The stick is still there, still wrapped in velvet. The wrapping just looks more like bureaucracy now. The lesson our ancestors learned, and that we still live with, is that violence isn't just about the blow. It's about who controls when it lands, how it's delivered, and what story gets told afterward. Law turned violence from a wild, unpredictable force into a disciplined servant, but it never stopped being violence. And if you've ever watched someone in power smile warmly while signing a document that ruins another person's life, you've seen the motif in action. The velvet is soft, the stick is hard, and the hand holding both never forgets which one does the work. Religion tells you it's about mercy, forgiveness, and love. That's the brochure. But for most of human history, the altar wasn't just a place for flowers and incense. It was also where the floorboards ran dark. Picture it a crowd gathered in the temple courtyard, the air thick with the smell of incense and sweat. At the center, a figure priest, shaman, or king dressed in fabrics dyed deep red, as if the dye itself was trying to get ahead of what's coming. Beside him, the offering bound, silent, sometimes resigned, sometimes struggling. The gods, it was said, demanded the best, and in many cultures the best meant human. This is the raw heart of the motif prayers written in blood. We didn't invent sacrifice out of cruelty. We invented it out of fear. Crops failed, rivers dried, storms flattened entire harvests. When you've planted every seed you have and the earth still answers with hunger, you start thinking in terms of trade. What do we give the powers above so they'll give us what we need? The logic is chillingly transactional. You want rain, you offer life. And the bigger the need, the bigger the gift. Animals for small favors, people for the big ones. The Aztecs are infamous for it. Captives led up temple steps, hearts cut out and raised to the sun. The body rolled down into the waiting crowd, but they weren't alone. Ancient Mesopotamians buried attendants alive with their kings so they could serve him in the afterlife. In ancient China, entire retinues were entombed with a ruler. In Iron Age Europe, bog bodies were found with ropes still around their necks, perfectly preserved in peat their deaths, both offering and warning. To us, it sounds monstrous. To them, it was maintenance. If the gods fed the world, the least you could do was feed the gods, and it worked, in its way. Not necessarily in changing the weather, but in changing people. A public sacrifice was more than a plea to the divine, it was a spectacle of power. It reminded everyone watching that the ruler not only spoke to the gods, but could command death in their name. No tax collector, no law enforcer could inspire the same mix of awe and dread as the man who made the rain come, whether by cloud or by knife. The religious justification made it cleaner. Killing for politics is petty. Killing for the gods is righteous. And if your god demanded it, who are you to argue to refuse would be to risk not just your own life, but the life of your family, your city, your entire people. The knife didn't have to be raised in anger. It could be raised in duty. That duty took many forms. Sometimes it was ceremonial, the victim dressed in fine clothes, fed well, paraded through the streets. Sometimes it was brutal and anonymous, a bound figure dragged to the altar at dawn, dispatched before the day's work began. Either way, The community participated. The crowd might chant, pray, sing hymns, ritual soundtracks to the moment steel met skin, and when it was done, there was silence. Always silence. We often imagine these moments as purely superstitious, a primitive misunderstanding of cause and effect. But there's a more unsettling layer sacrifice worked as social glue. It united the community in a shared act of belief and obedience. Everyone left knowing the cost of defiance and the reward of loyalty. And if you happened to be in power, it ensured that your vision of order was reinforced in the most unforgettable way possible. Some sacrifices were personal. A ruler might offer his own child to break a famine, a gesture that proved his devotion and his willingness to suffer with his people. Others were political theatre disguised as devotion rebels. Criminals or inconvenient rivals were declared cursed and given to the gods. The divine mandate made sure no one saw them as martyrs, they were simply necessary offerings. Blood on the altar wasn't just for appeasement, it was for proof. Proof that the ruler was in touch with forces no one else could command. Proof that the people could endure whatever was asked of them. Proof that the gods themselves sanctioned the order of things. And the tools of sacrifice were as symbolic as they were practical. In some cultures, the blade was made of precious metal or volcanic glass, materials as rare as the moment itself. In others, it was deliberately simple, to show that the act, not the instrument, held the power. Some sacrifices were made at dawn to wake the gods, others at dusk to close the day in good standing. The timing mattered. The gesture mattered. The blood always mattered. There's a grim irony in how often beauty wrapped itself around these killings. The altars were carved with intricate patterns. The victims might be adorned with flowers, feathers, jewels. Musicians played. Dancers moved in circles, their steps marking the rhythm of the inevitable. To modern eyes, it's a clash life's colour celebrating death's certainty. But to them, it was one thing an offering worth noticing. And we shouldn't pretend the impulse is gone. We still build rituals around sanctioned harm. We still accept loss when it's framed as for the greater good. We just change the stage. Public executions became court rulings. The temple steps became podiums. The gods became ideas, freedom, security, profit. But the choreography, the gathering, the speech, the decisive act remains eerily familiar. The emotional weight of sacrifice is double-edged. There's horror, yes, at the cost. But there's also a kind of grim comfort in believing the loss meant something, that the blood bought safety, that the suffering paid for a future. When the crowd left the temple, they didn't just leave behind a body, they left believing they had done their part to keep the world turning. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Sacrifice didn't just kill, it convinced. It turned death into proof of meaning, violence into devotion, fear into loyalty. The gods may or may not have been watching. The rulers certainly were. So the next time you hear about a culture that prayed with blood, remember they weren't just talking to heaven, they were talking to each other. And the message was clear. This is what belief looks like when it's sharp enough to draw blood. Empires like to be remembered for their architecture. Stone arches, marble palaces, roads that still stretch across continents. But those stones didn't lay themselves, and those roads didn't appear because some ruler woke up feeling generous. Every column, every aqueduct, every glittering capital was built on the same foundation conquest. It's the paradox of civilization. Its beauty and its brutality aren't opposites. They're twins. The more splendid the empire, the more skeletons under its floor. Rome understood this better than anyone. Civis Romanus sumai, a Roman citizen, was a badge of privilege, but only because Rome's legions had spent centuries making sure the rest of the world wasn't. While engineers drew up blueprints for amphitheatres, soldiers were laying siege to cities, salting fields, marching prisoners back to feed the building projects. A road might be paved to speed trade, but it also sped armies. Infrastructure was just war with better PR. The Persians built the royal road to knit their empire together, 1,500 miles of efficient movement, dotted with way stations. Merchants and messengers travelled it. Yes, but so did cavalry and siege equipment. The Great Wall of China wasn't a gentle border marker. It was a declaration in stone: we've fought you before, we'll fight you again, and we've got the masonry to prove it. The motif holds civilization and slaughter travel together. One hand raises the city, the other sharpens the blade. You can't separate them without toppling the whole structure. War was the engine that kept empires fed, both literally and figuratively. Conquered lands brought tribute grain, gold, livestock, labour. Those resources flowed back to the capital, filling storehouses, funding more armies, and yes, commissioning more temples and monuments. It was a cycle as predictable as the seasons expand, extract, embellish, repeat. But conquest wasn't just about resources. It was about theatre. A victorious general returning to Rome in a triumphal procession wasn't just celebrating a battle. He was advertising imperial power, captives in chains, exotic animals, carts piled with lootal proof that the empire was destined to rule. And for every child wide-eyed at the sight of an elephant, there was a father quietly noting that disobedience meant joining those captives. The artistry of war wasn't limited to swords and spears. It lived in logistics, in the ability to feed tens of thousands of men on campaign, to move siege towers across mountains, to coordinate fleets across seas. The Mongols turned horseback archery into a science. The Byzantines weaponized Greek fire into a terror that burned even on water. Every innovation in empire building was also an innovation in killing, and the killing was rarely neat. Siege warfare was a prolonged exercise in starvation and fear. The defenders watched their food dwindle while the attackers cut off every hope of relief. Sometimes, to break morale, besiegers catapulted diseased bodies over the walls, a grim preview of germ warfare. Other times, they promised mercy if the city surrendered, only to slaughter its inhabitants anyway, sending a clear message to the next target: surrender or die either way, we win. From a distance of centuries, it's tempting to admire the scale, the strategy, the sheer ambition. And yes, there's a certain awe in imagining the discipline of a phalanx advancing in perfect unison, or the architectural daring of a fortress carved into a cliff. But standing in the rubble of a burned city, with the smell of smoke and blood still thick in the air, the grandeur loses its shine. The truth is, empire turns war into policy. Under a banner, killing becomes not only acceptable but required. The general doesn't raid a village for personal gain. He pacifies a province. The treasury doesn't steal. It collects tribute. At this scale, individual deaths blur into numbers on a scribe scroll. The emotional distance makes it easier to keep the machine running, and yet, within the machine, individual acts of brutality and bravery stand out. An army might raise a city, but a single soldier might carry a child to safety. A ruler might order a massacre, but a captain might secretly spare prisoners. Empires are built from these contradictions, grand ideals printed on banners, ugly realities written in the dirt. Religion, once again, often served as co-pilot. Conquests were framed as divine missions. Victories proved the gods' favour. Defeats meant some ritual had been neglected. The Crusades, for example, marched under the sign of the cross, promising salvation for those who took up the sword. It was easier to spill blood when you could call it holy water. The propaganda was as carefully built as the walls. Inscriptions boasted of the king's victories, omitting the defeats. Reliefs on palace walls showed rows of captives bowing, never the moments before when they were dragged there. Coins carried the image of the ruler's face alongside symbols of strength. A lion, a spear, a laurel, wreath circulating the message with every transaction. And through it all, life in the empire went on. Markets bustled, children played, lovers met in secret. People learned to live with the constant shadow of war, because in an empire, peace is just the pause between campaigns. A farmer might plough the same field for decades, only to see it trampled overnight by an army marching to a battle hundreds of miles away. What makes empires so intoxicating, even in hindsight, is their dual legacy. They leave behind aqueducts and amphitheatres, libraries and legal systems gifts we still benefit from. But they also leave behind scars, mass graves, razed towns, languages erased, cultures bent or broken. To praise one without acknowledging the other is to miss the point entirely. Standing in the ruins of any great empire, you can feel both emotions at once. Admiration for the vision it took to build it, horror at the cost of keeping it. That's the emotional spine heareth and pichasir biyahez. It's the same feeling you get looking at a sword so beautifully made it could be in a museum, and then remembering what it was designed to do. Even today, the blueprint hasn't changed much. We still build infrastructure in the name of unity, knowing it doubles as a supply line. We still justify interventions as peacekeeping while preparing for war. And somewhere, someone is still sketching the next great monument, already calculating how many battles it will take to fund it. Because the truth, whispered in every stone arch and every blood-stained banner, is simple: civilization doesn't walk beside war it rides on its shoulders. And the higher the city walls rise, the deeper the shadows they cast. The Middle Ages dressed its violence in robes and hymns. Blood didn't just spill, it was blessed. Every blow was accompanied by a prayer. Every scream echoed in a churchyard. If empire had perfected the art of war as policy, medieval Europe perfected it as ritual. The Crusades were the purest expression of this marriage between faith and the dagger. Preachers in gilded cathedrals promised salvation for anyone willing to march east and reclaim the Holy Land. Pilgrimage became military campaign. The cross on your chest was both a passport and a death warrant. In sermons, priests described the journey in terms of duty and reward: fight for Christ, and the gates of heaven will open for you. What they didn't mention was the gates of Jerusalem and how they would have to be opened with fire and steel. When the First Crusade finally reached its destination in 1099, the victors entered the city not as pilgrims, but as executioners. Chroniclers wrote, almost proudly, that the streets ran ankle-deep with blood. Muslim, Jew, even Christian sects deemed heretical were cut down in the same holy purge. The air reeked of smoke and iron, prayers and curses rising together in the heat. For those wielding the sword, it was proof they had done God's work. For those under the blade, it was the end of the world. The motif fits perfectly: God above, blood below. In medieval thinking, there was no contradiction. The same hands that held the rosary could also draw the sword. Mercy was for the next life. Justice, if you could call it that, was delivered here and now, in steel. Beyond the battlefield, the Church sanctioned another theatre of righteous cruelty, public torture. Heresy wasn't just a crime, it was a contagion, and like any infection, it needed to be burned out. The Inquisition became the doctor, its tools as precise as they were merciless. Confession was the goal, and not truth. Not repentance, confession. And if the accused wouldn't give it willingly, the rack, the thumbscrew, and the strappado waited. The rituals were chilling in their orderliness. A reading of the charges, a blessing of the instruments, the offering of one last chance to come back to the light. Then the real work began. The audience was part of the process. Townspeople gathered to watch heretics humiliated, whipped, or broken. It wasn't morbid curiosity alone, it was catechism by spectacle. Each scream was a lesson: this is what happens to those who stray. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Merchants paused mid-sail. Even the executioner sometimes knelt in prayer before beginning. It was all done in the open, under banners bearing holy symbols. Some punishments doubled as sermons. Burning at the stake, for instance, wasn't just a means to kill, it was symbolic purification by fire. The condemned was bound. A priest recited final rites, and then the pyre was lit. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying the soul upward, or so the crowd was told. The irony was as thick as the ash mercy was promised, even as flesh blackened. And it wasn't only the church. Secular rulers borrowed the same language and ritual to enforce their authority. Wars between kingdoms were blessed by priests. Victories were celebrated with processions carrying relics. A crown and a crucifix often sat on the same table. Even executions for theft or treason were framed as moral cleansings. To kill with God's name on your lips was not murder, it was maintenance. What shocks us now is how normal it all was. Medieval society didn't flinch at the sight of a hanging or a limb being nailed to the city gate as a warning. Violence wasn't hidden, it was integrated. You could pray in the morning and watch an execution in the afternoon without feeling you'd crossed a moral line. In fact, the church said you hadn't. And this normalization gave violence a strange intimacy. Soldiers might kneel for mass before riding out to slaughter, convinced they were fulfilling divine will. Inquisitors might pray for the soul of a man they were about to stretch until his joints separated. Death wasn't the enemy, it was a tool. Even the weapons carried symbolism. The sword was the cross made deadly, its hilt forming the sign of salvation, its blade the edge of judgment. Banners bore the Lamb of God beside painted lances. Armour was etched with psalms, not just for decoration, but as protection against arrows, against fear, against doubt. It's tempting to think of all this as the work of zealots and sadists, but that oversimplifies the truth. Many who took part believed they were acting with absolute righteousness. A knight defending Christendom, a priest purging heresy. These roles carried honour, not shame. The violence was framed as love in its most severe form, saving souls by any means necessary. That framing made it almost impossible to resist. Refuse the call to crusade, and you risked your honour. Refuse to denounce a heretic, and you risked your soul. The machinery of faith was as effective as any army, and it had the same body count. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had perfected the spectacle. Cities competed to host the most elaborate processions. Whether celebrating a victory or executing a criminal, each event reinforced the same lesson: the world was ordered from above, and blood was part of that order. Looking back, the shock isn't just in the brutality, it's in the conviction. These weren't acts committed in spite of morality. They were morality, as understood at the time. And that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. When you believe with all your heart that God is above, the blood below doesn't just seem acceptable, it seems inevitable. Maps are supposed to be tidy things, inked lines, careful borders, neat labels, but every straight edge hides a jagged history. In the age of global conquest, cartography wasn't about geography, it was about ownership, and those maps were drawn in blood long before they were drawn in ink. The ships came first, great wooden jaws with sails for teeth, closing on every coastline worth biting. They brought flags, cannon, and the confidence of men who believed the world belonged to them simply because they'd arrived. Behind them came scribes, surveyors, and bureaucrats, the quieter weapons. A musket took a man's life. A ledger took his land, his language, his name. The violence was different from the screaming chaos of medieval battlefields. It was colder, more deliberate. This was violence with paperwork. Treaties signed in languages the partners couldn't read. Land deeds stamped with seals they'd never seen. Laws written to make theft look like trade. The theft wasn't just of gold or grain, it was of futures. Spain and Portugal divided the globe between them with the Treaty of Tordesillas, as if continents were slices of bread. Britain planted its flag from the Caribbean to India, France from West Africa to Quebec. The Dutch East India Company, an actual corporation, fielded armies, minted its own coins, and toppled governments. Imperialism didn't just conquer by force, it conquered by process. It created a system where everything the colonized did, planting, fishing, selling, now required permission from the colonizer. The motif holds maps drawn in blood. A red line across a page meant soldiers would march there. A shaded territory meant the people inside were now subjects. And the beauty of it for the conquerors was that once the lines were drawn, you could pretend the violence was over, but it wasn't. It had simply changed shape. Instead of raids, there were taxes. Instead of swords, there were quotas. Fail to meet them, and punishment came: burned villages, seized harvests, forced labour. The British in India imposed salt taxes so strict that even collecting the crystals left by the sun on the shore became illegal unless you paid for the privilege. In the Congo Free State, Leopold's personal fiefdom entire families were mutilated or killed if rubber quotas weren't met. It was civilizing, they said. Railroads were laid, ports were built, schools opened, but every track led to a mine, every port to a shipping lane for raw materials, every school to a curriculum designed to make the colonized think like the colonizer. Infrastructure wasn't charity, it was a siphon, and the law was the sharpest blade. Colonies operated under legal systems that favoured settlers at every turn. Disputes over land were decided in courts where only the conqueror's language counted. Punishments were harsher for the colonized, protections stronger for the colonizers. A man could be jailed or worse for hunting on land his family had used for generations, because that land now belonged to someone who had never even seen it. The violence wasn't always spectacular. Sometimes it was as quiet as a child forbidden to speak her native tongue at school, or a farmer watching soldiers uproot his crops to plant export goods instead. Sometimes it was being told that your gods were devils, your customs backward, your history irrelevant. Conquest didn't just take lives, it rewrote memory. Resistance flared everywhere: uprisings, guerrilla campaigns, refusals to work, but the machinery of empire was designed to absorb and outlast it. Rebellions were crushed, leaders executed or exiled. In some places, Collaborators were installed to govern on behalf of the empire, creating divisions that would outlive the colonizers themselves. The emotional spine here is that steady, contained fury. Because the worst part wasn't just the brutality, it was the normalization. Generations grew up knowing nothing else. Children learned the colonizers' anthem before they learned their own songs. Men served in the colonizers' army, fighting wars in countries they'd never heard of for a king they'd never meet. Women worked in homes where the very furniture had been bought with the wealth of their own stolen land. Colonial violence wore a suit. It spoke politely. It shook your hand with one palm while writing your death warrant with the other. It was slow, systemic, and often invisible to the people benefiting from it. And because it hid behind treaties and trade agreements, it could pretend to be progress. But the cracks showed. Famines swept through colonized lands not because food couldn't be grown, but because it was exported to feed the empire's cities. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed millions in British India, while grain was shipped overseas. In Ireland, during the Great Hunger, food left the ports under armed guard while the people starved. These weren't accidents, they were priorities. The cartographers kept working, redrawing lines as empires traded territories like cards. This is ours now. A map might say 1 year. No, now it's theirs. It would say the next. For the people living there, nothing changed except the flag over the governor's office and the accent of the man signing the decrees. And the maps weren't just political. They were resource maps, marking where the gold was, where the oil flowed, where the fertile land lay. These became the arteries of empire, and cutting into them could provoke an armed response faster than any insult to the flag. When independence movements finally came, they often inherited the same borders, the same laws, the same systems, only now the rulers looked like the ruled. The empire had left, but the map it drew remained, and with it remained disputes, divisions, and inequalities planted decades or centuries earlier. To walk through a museum in a former colonial capital is to see the quiet spoils statues from Africa, manuscripts from Asia, jewels mined in South America, each displayed with a placard about acquisition or expedition, as if those words could hide the theft. The objects are beautiful, yes, but they are also hostages, and yet there's a strange familiarity to it all. Modern trade deals echo the old treaties. Multinational corporations operate with the reach and influence of the old chartered companies. The tools have changed. Cargo ships replaced caravels. Spreadsheets replaced ledgers, but the principle is the same: wealth flows one way, and the map keeps getting redrawn to make sure it does. The global conquest wasn't just an age in history. It was a blueprint, one that taught the world how to dress domination in the language of law, how to make exploitation look like opportunity, how to erase a people without firing a shot be erasing their place on the map. And so, centuries later, we still live inside those lines. Borders drawn by men who never saw the rivers and mountains they cut through, still decide who can cross, who can trade, who can thrive. The ink has faded, but the blood underneath never did, because in the end, the map of the modern world isn't just a record of geography. It's a record of conquest. And if you look closely enough past the borders, past the names, you can still see the stains. The Enlightenment liked to imagine itself as the dawn after a long night. Reason replacing superstition, science replacing myth, rights replacing tyranny. Philosophers spoke of liberty, equality, fraternity. Pamphlets promised a new age where knowledge would free humanity from its darkest impulses. The irony, of course, is that many of those pamphlets were printed on paper made from cotton grown by slaves. This was the age when Europe liked to call itself civilized, and it did so with a straight face, even as it tightened the legal bolts on systems of exploitation. The guillotine was hailed as a humane execution device. Colonies were administered with codes of conduct and tax schedules so precise they could starve a people without ever firing a shot. Death had traded the cudgel and the sword for the robe, the ledger, and the fountain pen. The motif here is simple: death in a suit. Violence didn't disappear, it just learned manners. It was dressed in court procedure, buried in policy language, hidden in trade agreements. And because it no longer wore armour or carried a banner, people could pretend it wasn't violence at all. Take the 18th and 19th centuries, the high season of Enlightenment thought. While salons in Paris debated the rights of man, those same ideals were being quietly rewritten to exclude women, the poor, and anyone outside Europe. Liberty didn't mean freedom for everyone. It meant freedom for property owners, and sometimes, people were the property. In the United States, the Constitution, hailed as a masterpiece of human governance, contained the Three-Fifths Compromise, enshrining the value of enslaved Africans not as full people, but as fractions. That was law, drafted by men in powdered wigs, signed with ornamental pens, discussed in candlelit rooms with silverware on the table. Civilized. Lethal. Across the Atlantic, Britain passed laws to regulate child labour, not to abolish it, but to make it more reasonable. 12-year-olds could still work in factories, their spines bending under the weight of industrial machines. As long as they had Sundays off, the cruelty wasn't denied, it was administered. War, too, put on a more refined face. Instead of marauding knights or screaming hordes, armies now marched in straight lines. Uniforms pressed, muskets polished. Officers dined in tents on real china between battles. Orders were given in clipped, educated tones. And yet the killing didn't stop, it just became more efficient. Cannons were standardized, rifles mass-produced. Even atrocities were managed with bureaucratic precision. The British response to the Indian Rebellion of 1857 wasn't just to put down the uprising, but to make an example through mass executions, many carried out under the full gaze of colonial officers in tailored coats. French conquest in Algeria included policies of razzia, systematic destruction of villages, to starve resistance, all reported back to Paris in polite stamped memos. The Enlightenment's great contribution to violence was its ability to make it sound reasonable. Laws framed as maintaining order could be used to crush dissent. Civilizing missions justified invasions. Security allowed surveillance and mass arrests. Violence became a matter of policy, not passion. The Industrial Age took this one step further. Railroads weren't just for commerce, they were for troop movement. Telegraph lines didn't just carry news, they carried orders to suppress uprisings. Factories didn't just make plows, they made rifles and shells, and they could do it by the thousands. For the first time, war could be fought on a scale that made medieval slaughter look quaint. But the killing wasn't always on battlefields. The modern state learned to make life unlivable for its enemies without ever pulling a trigger. Economic blockades, embargoes, and sanctions could collapse an economy and starve a population just as effectively as an invading army. You could wipe out thousands without ever leaving your capital, and the great trick was that it all looked on paper like progress. Governments published reports, held debates, and passed legislation. The violence was slow, predictable, and above all deniable. If people died, it was unfortunate. If they starved, it was a regrettable consequence. The language was as clean as the killing was dirty. Even in the so-called age of human rights, the pattern held. The very institutions created to protect life could be used to end it. Laws banning sedition could mean the execution of writers. Regulations on public safety could mean the clearing of entire neighborhoods for development that benefited the rich while leaving the poor homeless. Civilization had mastered the art of killing without looking like it was killing. It wasn't a soldier's blade anymore. It was a politician's pen, a judge's gavel, a banker's signature. The weapons were contracts, court rulings, corporate mergers. And because these weapons didn't spill blood in the streets, not immediately, not visibly, they were easier to ignore. If a man was hanged in the square, the whole town knew. If he was priced out of his land by new tax laws, his children sent to labour because the school now charged fees, his wife dead from a preventable illness because the hospital required payment up front, well, that didn't make the front page. It was violence with plausible deniability. This is where the doubt creeps in the emotional spine of this chapter. Because once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. The handshake between businessmen may have been signed in ink, but the profits it secures may come from labour camps. The elegant speech about liberty may coincide with a law stripping that liberty from someone else. The 20th century would make this explicit. Colonial powers, under pressure to grant independence, created legal agreements so riddled with economic dependency that the freed nations remained trapped. Dictatorships were supported or toppled depending on which outcome served the investors. Intelligence agencies orchestrated coups, complete with staged elections, all to protect trade routes and resource access. And all of it came with official seals, polite communiques, and press statements assuring the public that it was in the interest of stability. If the medieval world believed gods will justify blood, the modern world believed the market did. Economic growth could excuse poisoned rivers, dead miners, and flattened forests. National security could excuse censorship, torture, and surveillance. The language had changed, but the principle hadn't. Those with power would keep it, even if it meant killing so long as they could keep their gloves clean. And yet, the vest and tie, the conference table and the parliamentary debate give it all an illusion of morality. People want to believe that civilization is a cure for violence, but maybe it's just a better disguise, because the truth is civilization doesn't end violence, it organizes it. It doesn't stop the killing, it schedules it. And it doesn't replace the sword with the pen, it simply learns to use both. Somewhere in the archives, in a folder labelled with something sterile like Policy 178B, there's a memo that sealed a village's fate. Somewhere in a bank, there's a ledger entry for a loan that built a dam and drowned an entire valley. Somewhere in a courtroom there is a judgment that uprooted thousands in the name of urban renewal. These aren't accidents, they're decisions. That's why the modern violence of the civilized world is so insidious. You can live inside it your whole life and never notice. Until one day the line on the map shifts. The rules change, and you find yourself on the wrong side of both. Then you'll understand that the suit doesn't make the man civilized. It just means he can commit the same acts in better tailoring. And by then, the ink will already be dry. The 20th century promised miracles. It delivered, just not always the ones we wanted. In the same breath that humanity split the atom, it learned how to turn that split into a city-destroying fireball. The same laboratories that made vaccines also designed nerve gas. And in more than one case, they were the same laboratories. The motif here: the laboratory and the battlefield under the same roof isn't poetic license. It's historical fact. The building that cured you in peacetime might kill you in war, and the men and women in white coats weren't always sure which side of the line they were working on. The optimism was real. Electricity lit the night. Antibiotics saved soldiers who would have died of infection in earlier wars. Airplanes shrank the world to hours instead of days. But every advance seemed to carry its shadow. Planes dropped food and medicine and bombs. The same chemistry that made synthetic rubber for tires also made explosives for artillery shells. The same industrial processes that produced fertilizer could, with a slight change, produce weapons-grade ammonium nitrate. In 1914, the First World War began as a contest of armies. It ended as a contest of chemists. Chlorine gas rolled across the trenches, a pale green fog that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. Mustard gas lingered in the soil for weeks, turning entire landscapes into uninhabitable wounds. The men who developed these weapons often argued they were humane compared to traditional killing, quick, efficient, and sometimes leaving the body intact. But the survivors, coughing blood decades later, might have disagreed. It was the first taste of something new, war fought not just with what you could build, but with what you could think. The front line wasn't only in the mud, it was in the laboratory notebook, in the blueprint, in the patent office. Scientists became soldiers, and soldiers became test subjects. The interwar years didn't slow the arms race. If anything, they professionalized it. Laboratories became national assets. Funding funneled to those projects that could give strategic advantage, and the scope widened. Physics gave us radar, sonar, and rockets. Chemistry gave us better propellants and more lethal poisons. Biology more quietly began looking into how diseases might be weaponized. It was all theoretical, of course, until it wasn't. World War II was the full convergence of science and slaughter. The Manhattan Project is the most famous example, a collaboration of the greatest scientific minds of the era, from Oppenheimer to Fermi, working under military command to create a weapon that could end the war or the world. In less than 3 years, they went from equations on a chalkboard to the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The brilliance was undeniable. So was the devastation. Elsewhere, science was applied with a different kind of horror. Nazi doctors conducted experiments on prisoners in concentration camps, freezing them to test hypothermia treatments, infecting them with diseases to test cures, mutilating them to study survival rates. In Japan, Unit 731 carried out vivisections without anesthesia, releasing plague-infested fleas into Chinese villages to study outbreaks. These were not the shadows of science, they were its direct misuse, wrapped in the language of research, the data carefully recorded, the reports filed. And the uncomfortable truth is that after the war, much of that data was quietly absorbed by the victors, Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to the United States to work on rocketry, medicine, and aerospace. Soviet programs absorbed their own share. The morality of the source was often set aside if the information was useful. The laboratory and the battlefield were now officially partners. Even the peace dividends of science had a dual edge. Nuclear power promised clean energy, but every reactor carried the knowledge and infrastructure to produce weapons-grade material. Advances in aviation made global travel possible and made global bombing campaigns feasible. The transistor made computers smaller and guided missiles more precise. Every invention was a coin with two faces. One marked progress, the other war. The Cold War took this marriage to its logical conclusion. Space exploration was never just about exploration. The rockets that sent satellites into orbit could also carry nuclear warheads across continents. The same surveillance satellites that mapped the moon could map missile silos. Even climate science, still in its infancy, was explored for its potential military applications, from weather modification to environmental sabotage. Science also expanded the battlefield into new domains. Computers made possible the concept of cyber warfare. Communications encryption and decryption became critical frontline tools. Biotechnology opened the door to genetic engineering with the whispered possibility of targeted biological weapons. The more we understood about the building blocks of life, the more it became possible to weaponize them. And yet, for all its dangers, it's impossible not to feel a measure of awe at the scale of what was achieved. The same decade that produced the hydrogen bomb also mapped the human genome. The same minds that developed missile guidance systems also sent probes to Mars. It's this duality that makes the modern age so unsettling, the recognition that the genius capable of curing disease is also capable of engineering the perfect weapon. This is where the emotional spine comes into play, admiration and fear in equal measure. You can look at the Saturn V rocket and see the pinnacle of human engineering. You can also see a delivery system for a nuclear warhead that could erase a city. The design is beautiful, the purpose terrifying, and the line between civilian and military research has never been truly solid. Governments fund projects for one purpose and adapt them for another. Private corporations develop technologies for profit, only to find them purchased and repurposed by defense contractors. The internet itself, the great democratizer of information, began as ARPANET, a military communication project designed to survive nuclear war. The ethical debates have never caught up to the pace of innovation. By the time society begins to discuss whether a technology should be used, it's often already in production. And once it exists, it's difficult to uninvent. Chemical weapons may be banned by treaty, but the knowledge to make them remains. Biological weapons may be outlawed, but laboratories capable of producing them still operate, often under the guise of defense research. In this sense, science doesn't just serve war, it future-proofs it. The weapons of tomorrow are being designed today, and the research that makes them possible may be indistinguishable from research meant for peaceful purposes. A better drone delivery system could mean faster packages. It could also mean unmanned assassinations. A breakthrough in artificial intelligence could revolutionize healthcare or make autonomous killing machines possible. And this is the point where the awe turns to unease. Because we're no longer in an era where science needs to catch up to war. We're in an era where war is waiting for science to arrive. Every new field, nanotechnology, quantum computing, synthetic biology, is scouted for military application before it's even fully understood by the public. The laboratory and the battlefield don't just share a roof anymore. They share a budget. It's tempting to think of this as a problem for governments and generals, but it isn't. Civilian life is already saturated with the products of this partnership. Your GPS navigation. Originally a U.S. military project. The weather data on your phone. Collected by satellites launched with dual-use capability. The very materials in your laptop. Rare earth metals are mined in locations that have sparked territorial disputes and armed conflict. In the end, the story of science and slaughter isn't one of corruption or betrayal. It's a story of capacity. Humanity's ability to understand and manipulate the world is morally neutral. What we do with that capacity is not. And history shows we have been as eager to weaponize our breakthroughs as to celebrate them. So we live in the shadow of this double-edged legacy. Every advance carries its ghost. Every cure carries its curse. And somewhere, in a clean, well-lit room, someone is working on the next marvel or the next atrocity. Possibly both. Modern war doesn't always look like war. You don't have to see the enemy. You don't have to swing a sword or even shoulder a rifle. You can end a life or a million with the weight of a finger on a button. The motif here is simple: a button instead of a blade. And the distance between those two is the distance between the old world and ours. The First World War was the dress rehearsal. The scale of killing was industrial. For the first time, machine guns cutting down waves of soldiers in seconds. Artillery shells that could land a mile away and still erase everything in a radius. Men dug into trenches for months. Their lungs raw from the damp, their ears ringing from constant bombardment. You could die without ever seeing the face of the man who killed you. Death came from the horizon, from the sky, from the unseen barrel. But even then, there was still the illusion of space battlefields were over there. Civilians could read about the war in the papers, send letters to the front, and still wake up under the same roof every morning. That illusion didn't survive the next round. World War II erased the line between soldier and civilian. Cities became targets. Factories, schools, rail stations, all were fair game. London learned to sleep underground. Dresden burned so hot the air turned to firestorms. In Asia, Nanjing bled under the boots of an invading army. Civilians didn't just die by accident. They were the point. Break the enemy's will by breaking their home. Technology made it possible, and bureaucracy made it efficient. Long-range bombers meant no place was out of reach. Logistics chains meant destruction could be scheduled like a train timetable. Precision wasn't always the goal in some cases. Imprecision was the point. The more widespread the damage, the harder it was to recover. And then came August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. One plane, one bomb. One city reduced to a shadow in less than a minute. Survivors spoke of people simply vanishing the heat so intense it burned outlines of bodies into walls. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The world had entered a new phase, the ability to end a war or civilization in the time it takes to exhale. The psychological shift was permanent. For all of human history, war had been brutal, but it had limits. A blade could only reach as far as your arm, a bullet as far as your aim. Now, a single order could destroy a city on the other side of the planet. The nuclear age meant that survival wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about making sure the battle never started. This created a new kind of fear, one that wasn't tied to borders or troop movements. In the Cold War, the front line was everywhere and nowhere. Children practiced hiding under desks, as if wood and metal could shield them from a nuclear blast. Politicians spoke in calm tones about mutually assured destruction, as if the words themselves could make the concept less insane. War became as much about the threat as the act. Entire strategies were built around not pressing the button, but keeping your finger close enough that everyone knew you could. The weapon was no longer the bomb, it was the knowledge that you had it. For soldiers, the battlefield was unrecognizable compared to their grandfathers' wars. Drones, satellites, guided missiles, these meant you could strike without warning, without risk to yourself, and without ever standing on the soil you were destroying. For civilians, the reality was worse. Your safety depended on calculations you'd never see. Decisions made in rooms you'd never enter, by people you'd never meet. And if the old wars had rules, however often they were broken, modern war blurred them to the point of uselessness. Combatants could be illegal. Civilians could be collateral damage. The language softened the reality. But the reality didn't soften for the people on the ground. In Iraq, in Syria, in countless other places, airstrikes hit wedding parties, hospitals. Schools always followed by a press release about tragic mistakes. The emotional spine of modern war is this panic and helplessness. Panic, because the speed of destruction means you can't run from it. Helplessness, because the decisions are so far removed from the people they affect that protest feels meaningless. In medieval times, you could at least see the man swinging the sword. Now, the hand that ends your life might be thousands of miles away, drinking coffee in an air-conditioned room, and yet, for all this, modern war still carries the same old justifications. Leaders talk about security, liberation, the defense of freedom, the same words their ancestors used before sending men into the mud. The only difference is scale. Before, you might lose a village. Now, you can lose a continent. There's no undoing the knowledge. Once a button replaces a blade, it's only a matter of time before someone presses it. And the terrifying truth is, in modern war, victory doesn't mean you live, it just means you get to decide who doesn't. The Cold War was named well, but not because it was harmless. It was cold only in the sense that the world's two biggest arsenals didn't meet head-on in open battle. In every other way, it burned hot in fear, in paranoia, in the slow suffocation of living under the constant threat that someone, somewhere, might decide to press the button. The motif is war without gunfire. It's the war you can't hear until it's too late, the one fought in headlines and whispers, in coded radio messages and in the way neighbours stop trusting each other. After 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Both had the same terrible new toy nuclear weapons. Direct conflict risked mutual annihilation, so the battlefield shifted into something quieter, and in some ways more insidious. The front lines were in other people's countries. The weapons were ideology, espionage, and the manipulation of perception itself. For ordinary people, it was a war fought in the background hum of life. The news always seemed to carry a new crisis: Berlin, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. Some of these flared into open conflict, others stayed as tense standoffs, but none of them were isolated. They were chess moves in a game too big for most of the players to even see the board. Propaganda became a primary weapon. Every movie, every broadcast, every school lesson could carry a message. In the West, the enemy was painted as joyless, grey-uniformed, and dangerous. In the East, the enemy was decadent, selfish, and corrupt. Children in both systems grew up convinced they were the good guys, and the other side was one bad day away from invading. This wasn't paranoia without purpose. Intelligence agencies, the CIA, the KGB operated like invisible armies. They didn't wear uniforms, but they carried out missions as dangerous as any battlefield maneuver coups in foreign governments. Covert funding of rebel groups, targeted assassinations dressed up as accidents. In this new kind of war, victory wasn't about territory, it was about influence. A country could be won without a single soldier crossing its border, simply by making sure its leaders, its press, and its policies aligned with your side. Elections could be influenced. Movements could be funded or crushed from thousands of miles away. The battlefield was in boardrooms, embassies, and radio towers. The psychological toll was immense. In the 1950s and 60s, schoolchildren in the United States practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if that would shield them from a nuclear blast. In the Soviet Union, citizens lined up for gas masks, drilled on where to go when the sirens wailed. Neither side truly believed survival was likely in a real exchange, but both pretended otherwise because to admit the truth was to admit the whole thing was madness. Spies became cultural icons, but the real ones didn't live glamorous lives. They lived under constant suspicion, cut off from genuine relationships, always aware that one wrong word could mean exposure and execution. Some never knew if the friend they had drinks with was a genuine ally or an assigned handler. Double agents lived with the knowledge that their own side might decide they were too much of a liability to keep alive. The fear wasn't just vertical between governments and citizens, it was horizontal. Communities became watchtowers. In America, the Red Scare encouraged people to report suspicious neighbours. In Eastern Bloc countries, secret police cultivated networks of informants that could include co-workers, classmates, even family. Trust was a luxury, and the violence, while less visible, was still there. Proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan killed millions, all in the name of containing or spreading influence. These conflicts were fought far from Washington and Moscow, but they were fueled, funded, and armed by both. For the locals, there was nothing cold about them. The bombs still fell, the blood still ran. Economic warfare was another front. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and resource manipulation could cripple economies without firing a shot. Food shortages, inflation, and unemployment became tools to pressure governments into shifting allegiance. The suffering was indirect but deliberate. What made this war feel suffocating was its lack of resolution. Medieval battles ended when one side was dead or surrendered. Even in the industrial wars of the 20th century, peace treaties eventually came. But the Cold War stretched on for decades with no clear end in sight. The tension became normal, The possibility of annihilation became background noise. People learned to live with it the way you live with a chronic illness, never forgetting it's there, never knowing when it might flare into something fatal. That uncertainty was its own form of violence. The fear of what might happen often did as much damage as anything that actually did. And when the Cold War finally ended in 1991, it didn't end the way stories are supposed to. There was no decisive battle, no formal surrender. One side simply collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and debts. The Berlin Wall fell, and the world exhaled, but the structures of surveillance, propaganda, and covert control didn't vanish. They just adapted. In that sense, the Cold War never truly ended. The tools it refined, psychological pressure, disinformation, economic leverage, are still in play, used by governments, corporations, and individuals alike. The battlefield is just harder to see now, because it is in your pocket, in the form of a glowing screen. Cold violence lingers because it doesn't need to win outright. It just needs to make you hesitate, doubt, and distrust. It thrives on the idea that you'll never be sure what's true, never fully believe the person next to you, never feel entirely safe. And in that way, it's the most efficient kind of war there is, one that can go on forever, without ever having to fire a single shot. Statistically speaking, you're safer now than at almost any other point in human history. Your chances of being stabbed in the street, speared in battle, or burned at the stake are vanishingly small compared to your ancestors. The average citizen of the Middle Ages faced more daily threats before breakfast than you'll probably see all year. And yet it doesn't feel that way, because while the blade has been sheathed in most parts of the world, the shouting never stopped. It just changed delivery methods. The motif for our time is the keyboard is the new spear, and like the spear, it's light, easy to use, and surprisingly effective at causing harm from a safe distance. If history was once measured in wars, today it's measured in arguments. Scroll through the digital public square Twitter, Facebook, whatever it's calling itself this week, and you'll see battle lines drawn in real time. Instead of swords, there are words. Instead of armor, there are avatars. And instead of a general rallying troops, there's an influencer firing off a thread. It's tempting to laugh this off as harmless. After all, no one dies from a meme. But anyone who's been on the receiving end of a digital dogpile knows the wounds are real, reputation shredded, livelihoods lost, mental health scorched, and unlike an old-fashioned duel, the fight doesn't end when one person drops their weapon. Screenshots are forever. The irony is rich as physical violence has declined. We've become more inventive in finding ways to attack without touching. Where our ancestors swung clubs, we swing sarcasm. Where they threw spears, we throw subtweets. The exchange rate is different. Fewer funerals, more therapy sessions, but the instinct is the same. There's even strategy. Armies used to march in formation. Now they mass in group chats and private servers, coordinating hashtags, memes, and outrage cycles. Battles can erupt over politics, sports, celebrity gossip, or the shape of a fictional character's nose in a movie trailer. The trigger doesn't have to be important, it just has to be visible. And like any good weapon, the keyboard is both offensive and defensive. You can use it to rally allies, defend your honor, or bury an opponent under an avalanche of replies. You can also watch from the sidelines, picking off targets of opportunity with a carefully timed joke. In this way, modern conflict has democratized. You no longer need to be a soldier, a knight, or a trained assassin. All you need is Wi-Fi and an opinion. The emotional spine here is self-awareness, the realization that you're not just observing this shift, you're in it. Every time you like a spicy take, share a clip that humiliates someone, or join a pylon, you're part of the machinery. You may never have spilled blood, but you've probably contributed to a bruise. The scale is different, but the sensation is ancient. The rush of victory when your comment lands, the satisfaction of watching an opponent retreat, the group bond forged in a shared enemy. These were once the feelings of warriors around a campfire. Now they're the feelings of strangers in a Reddit thread. Of course, the consequences don't stop at the screen. Digital disputes spill into the physical world, jobs lost, friendships broken, real-world threats sent to real-world addresses. And while the casualty count is lower, the reach is far wider. In a medieval feud, only those present saw your humiliation. Today, the whole world can watch it in 4K. This is to say the world is entirely without physical danger, Wars still happen. People still die in them. But for many of us, especially in the wealthy, internet-saturated corners of the globe, the primary battleground is cultural and conversational. It's less about who controls the hill and more about who controls the narrative. That's where the shift gets interesting. In traditional combat, you fought for territory, resources, survival. In today's battles, you often fight for attention. Outrage becomes a currency, traded for clicks, shares, and algorithmic favor. The bigger the reaction you provoke, the more influence you wield. In that sense, the loudest voice can have more power than the largest army. And the battlefield is constant. There's no winter truce, no agreed-upon season for war. The internet is open 24/7 and so are the arguments. You can log off, but you can't stop the fight from continuing without you. And when you come back, the lines may have shifted, the alliances may have changed, and you may discover that you've become the villain in a story you didn't know you were in. All of this makes the modern form of conflict strangely exhausting. You're not dodging arrows, but you're always dodging notifications. You're not tending wounds, but you are tending your image, and the stress of constant readiness, the low-level hum of what fresh hell will I wake up to today is its own kind of attrition. It's worth remembering that this is a privilege of relative safety. You can afford to treat words as weapons only when you're not worried about actual weapons. The freedom to fight with nothing but ideas, insults, and emojis is built on the luxury of not needing to fight for your life, which might be why the fights can get so vicious the stakes are low enough to let people go all in. In the end, less stabbing, more shouting might be progress, but it's not peace. It's just a different kind of war, one that trades blood for bandwidth and scars you where the eye can't see. And if you think you're above it, take a look at your browser history, your comment threads, your private messages. Chances are the spear is already in your hands. For most of human history, survival favored the sharp edges, the strongest arms, the quickest reflexes, the willingness to do whatever it took. Those were the traits that got passed on. Mercy was nice in a fireside story, but it didn't put meat in the pot. If you had a temper and a club, you had options. But somewhere along the line, something strange happened. We began selecting for a different kind of strength. Not the ability to crush, but the ability to hold back. The science crowd calls it self-domestication, but that makes it sound like we were wild horses who just decided to accept the saddle. The truth is both simpler and stranger over thousands of years. We bred ourselves into being less dangerous, and, in doing so, became more capable. Think about the wolves that became dogs. The fiercest wolves didn't line up to be fed by humans. The ones that did were the ones who could control their fear and aggression long enough to accept a scrap of food without biting the hand that offered it. They didn't stop being wolves overnight. They still had teeth, still had the instincts, but over generations. The rough edges dulled, ears flopped, eyes softened. Eventually, you got something that could nap by the fire instead of tearing down the door. We did that to ourselves. Not literally, we didn't all start wagging our tails and begging for belly rubs, but we learned to survive in bigger and bigger groups, which meant learning to stop treating everyone outside your immediate family as a threat. In the Stone Age, living in a band of 20 people was normal. If you couldn't get along with someone, you could just walk away and never see them again. But in a farming village of 200 or a city of 2,000, walking away wasn't an option. You had to learn to swallow the insult, control the temper, keep the peace because everyone's survival depended on it. Over time, the people who couldn't do that, who lashed out too often or too violently, found themselves on the wrong end of group judgment. Sometimes that meant exile. Sometimes it meant a quick trip to the edge of the village with no return ticket. Either way, they didn't pass on as many genes. Meanwhile, the people who could read a room, negotiate a truce, or just let an argument die without throwing a punch, they thrived. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A group that could keep its members from killing each other had more hands for the harvest, more eyes on watch for predators, more people to share the work. Less internal violence meant more energy for the threats that actually mattered. Over generations, the softer traits, patience, empathy, cooperation became as valuable as muscle and speed. Self-domestication didn't just change behavior, it changed bodies. Anthropologists have noted that over the last tens of thousands of years, human skulls have gotten slightly smaller and less rugged, brow ridges shrank, jaws became lighter. We literally look less intimidating than our ancestors. If you put a modern man in jeans next to a Cro-Magnon in the same outfit, you'd probably guess the Cro-Magnon was the one you didn't want to meet in a dark alley. And yet here we are, the jeans-wearing descendants of the softer ones, running the world. We still have the capacity for violence, but for most of us, it's no longer the first tool we reach for. We solve disputes with courts, contracts, and let's be honest, customer service complaints. If that sounds pathetic compared to swinging a sword, remember that swords can only solve one kind of problem. Paper, pens, and patience can solve hundreds. It's easy, especially for men raised in cultures that value toughness, to see this as some kind of loss. We imagine our great-great-grandfathers were harder, braver, more capable because they faced dangers we never will. And in some ways, they were. But they were also more likely to die young, leave orphans, and pass down grudges instead of inheritances. Our softness, such as it is, comes with its own kind of strength. It takes control to hold your tongue instead of throwing a punch. It takes strategy to outmaneuver a rival without ever touching them. It takes vision to invest in something that might not pay off for years instead of taking whatever you can now. And those are the traits that have let us build cities, trade across oceans, and survive not by outkilling the competition, but by outlasting them. Of course, self-domestication hasn't made us angels. We still find ways to compete, to dominate, to fight as we've seen. Sometimes we just do it with words or laws instead of blades. But the point is, we've raised the threshold for when violence is acceptable. That's progress. It's also personal. Think about your own life. If you've ever walked away from an argument for the sake of your marriage, you've practiced self-domestication. If you've ever let an employee's mistake slide because you knew it would teach them more than yelling would, you've reinforced it. If you've ever bitten your tongue in a meeting because the long game mattered more than being right in the moment, congratulations, you're part of the great civilizing project. There's hope in that. If our species has managed to shift itself over thousands of years toward more cooperation and less raw aggression, then we can keep doing it. We can keep raising the bar for what it takes to push us into real conflict. We can keep making it harder for the worst instincts to win. And maybe, just maybe, we can turn that same softening outward into the way nations deal with each other. The truth is, our softness is situational. We still have the hardware for violence, but the software's been updated. Most of us go years, even decades, without being in a physical fight. That's a monumental achievement when you think about how things used to be, and it's not because we've forgotten how, it's because we've learned when not to. There's a quiet kind of pride in that, especially for men who've lived long enough to see both sides. You can look back and remember the times you could have escalated, could have swung back, and you didn't. You can see the families, friendships, and businesses that survived because you chose the slow burn over the quick strike. And you can recognize that those moments, invisible as they are to history, are what actually keep the world stitched together. We've softened, and that's our strength. Not because it makes us harmless, it doesn't, but because it makes us deliberate. We can still hit hard if we have to. We just choose not to, most of the time. And that choice, made over and over across millions of lives, is what's kept our species from tearing itself apart. For all our flaws, for all the ways we still find to hurt each other, that's worth holding on to. Because the next chapter of our history will be written not by the sharpest blade, but by the steadiest hand. They tell you humanity has evolved, that we've outgrown the brutality of our ancestors, traded clubs for contracts, spears for speeches. But if you've lived long enough, you know that's not the whole truth. You can feel it in your own bones, somewhere inside you. There are two forces sharing the same body, the violent ape and the poet. The ape is ancient, has the part of you that sizes people up the second they walk into the room, the part that knows the weight of a clenched fist without ever having to be taught. He doesn't care about laws, reputations, or collateral damage. His logic is survival. His language is force. You might think you've buried him under decades of manners and meetings, but he's still there, waiting for the right moment or the wrong one. And then there's the poet. He's no less ancient, though we forget that. He's the part that looks for patterns in the clouds, that builds bridges instead of burning them. He remembers faces not as threats, but as stories. His survival strategy isn't domination, it's connection. Where the ape asks, "How do I win?" the poet asks, "How do we keep going?" Most days, you live somewhere between the two. You negotiate with the rude driver instead of ramming his bumper. You listen to criticism without turning it into a duel. You resist the cheap victory of saying the one thing you know would wound someone deeply. It's not that the ape doesn't want to, it's that the poet has the floor. But the contest never ends. It's not a war with a winner, it's a constant vote, every day, in every decision that matters. You've been in those moments, the seconds where everything goes quiet, where you can feel the weight of both options. A man disrespects you in front of your peers. Your child makes a mistake that costs you money. A competitor spreads lies about your work. And there's that flicker, I could end this now. End the insult. End the threat. Make an example so big no one ever tries it again. That's the ape talking. He's persuasive because he speaks in the oldest language you know. Action. Finality. Control. But the poet doesn't go quietly. He reminds you of the things that come after the doors that close, the bridges that burn, the long tail of consequences that you can't cut away once they've started. He asks you to think about your own reflection years from now, whether you'll like the man looking back. The truth is, both voices have their place. There are moments where the ape keeps you alive, where action is necessary and hesitation would be fatal. And there are moments where the poet saves you from yourself, where restraint keeps you in the game long after a single victory would have ended it. What makes this the final contest is that it's personal. Civilizations can pass laws, write treaties, build courts, armies can disarm, politicians can sign pacts. But none of that means anything if, in the moment, the individual you choose is the wrong voice. History is just the sum of billions of private choices. A war doesn't start because a country decides it. It starts because someone, somewhere, couldn't resist the ape's argument. If you've built a business, raised a family, led a team, you've fought this contest more times than you can count. Maybe you won more than you lost. Maybe you didn't. But every time you felt that pull, the flush in your neck, the heat in your chest, the narrowing of your vision, you were standing in the ring with both of them. The older you get, the more you realize the stakes aren't always what you think. When you're young, the ape's victories feel like triumphs. You told them off. You put them in their place. You showed them you wouldn't be messed with. But years later, you start counting the opportunities lost, the relationships soured, the deals that never happened because of a single hard swing. And yet, choosing the poet isn't about weakness. It's not about letting people walk all over you. It's about control, real control, the kind that lasts longer than the rush of winning a fight. It's about understanding that the final contest is never about the other person. It's about you. Every man alive carries this double inheritance. It doesn't matter if you're a CEO or a carpenter, a grandfather or a young father, the ape and the poet both live in your chest. One is loud, the other is steady. One wants to end the problem now, the other wants to keep the story going. And you, whether you admit it or not, are the referee. There's a kind of peace in accepting that neither side will ever vanish. The goal isn't to kill the ape or to silence the poet. The goal is to know them both well enough to know when to hand over the microphone, and to know that the hardest victories are the ones no one else sees, the ones where you walk away. Not because you couldn't win, but because winning would have cost too much. You won't always get it right. No one does. There will be days when the ape gets the better of you, when you say the thing you shouldn't, when you take the shot you later regret. There will be days when the poet holds back too much, when you let something slide that needed to be stopped. The measure isn't perfection, it's the trend line. Which way are you tilting, more often than not? If there's a reward for fighting this contest well, it's not a trophy. It's the life you get to keep living, the partnerships that endure, the children who still call, the friends who trust you with the truth. It's the knowledge that you didn't burn everything down the first time you felt the spark. The violent ape and the poet will be with you until your last day. They are your inheritance from every ancestor who ever fought, and from every ancestor who ever forgave. You didn't choose to carry them, but you choose every day which one leads. And maybe that's the real mark of civilization, not the laws we pass, the cities we build, or the wars we avoid. but the quiet moments when one man, unseen by anyone else, chooses the poet over the ape. Not because it's easy, because it's right. Imagine a lump of clay, not yet shaped, not yet hardened. It sits on a workbench in the late afternoon sun, warm to the touch, still giving under your fingers. That's us. That's humanity right now. For all the history behind us, the swords, the walls, the graves and the victories the clay hasn't set, we are still forming. If you've ever worked clay, you know it carries two truths at once. One, it's fragile. The wrong move can collapse the whole shape in seconds. Two, it's full of possibility. You can take what's in front of you and turn it into something entirely different, something better. We like to tell ourselves that the world is fixed, that the shape we live in now is the one we're stuck with. Wars will always happen. Greed will always win. Human nature will always find a way to drag us back into the mud. It's a comforting story in its own way, because it means we're off the hook. We can change what's just the way things are. But if history has shown us anything, is that the way things are has never been permanent. Think about it 100 years ago. The average man expected to see at least one major war in his lifetime. 50 years ago, half the jobs we know now didn't exist. 20 years ago, most of us couldn't imagine carrying the whole sum of human knowledge in our pockets. The shape of our lives changes faster than we realize, and it's not all the work of violence. Some of it is the quiet, deliberate work of choosing differently. The clay is still wet, and if we choose to shape it toward peace, we might finally start breaking the oldest cycle we have. That doesn't mean erasing the ape well. Never do that, and maybe we shouldn't. The capacity for defense, for standing ground, for protecting what matters that's valuable clay too. But we can put it in proportion. The poet can lead, and the ape can guard the rear. What would it look like if we truly leaned into that? For one, the resources we spend preparing to destroy each other could be redirected to building things that outlast us. Roads that connect rather than divide. Systems that feed rather than hoard. Technology that frees rather than enslaves. It's easy to scoff at that vision, especially for men who've seen enough of the world to know its sharp edges. You might hear words like that and think they belong on a bumper sticker or a politician's podium, not in a serious conversation. But you've also seen what happens when we don't choose peace. You've seen the costs that never make it into the history books, the sons who don't come home, the towns that never recover, the lives that dissolve quietly after the noise has faded. Choosing peace doesn't mean becoming naive. It means working with the clay while we still can, before it hardens into a shape no one wanted. It means looking past the next quarter, the next election, the next news cycle, and asking what shape you want to leave for the hands that come after yours. There's a personal version of this. 2. In your own life, the clay is still wet. You can still change how you handle conflict. You can still choose to build instead of break, to listen instead of lash out. You can still repair relationships that have been dented, still create something new from pieces you thought were ruined. And here's the thing, choosing peace in your own life doesn't just make your days quieter. It ripples outward. The men you mentor, the families you raise, the people who watch how you handle a challenge, they carry that example forward. The clay in their hands takes a slightly different shape because of yours. If enough people do that, the shape of the world shifts. Not overnight, not in a way that makes headlines, but steadily. Like water shaping stone. The change is slow until suddenly. It's undeniable. We can't control the whole kiln, but we can control the bit of clay in front of us. We can choose to smooth it instead of gouging it. We can choose to keep it pliable, to leave room for those who come after to keep shaping it. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that lasts. The future isn't inevitable. It's a draft. And every conversation, every decision, every refusal to let the ape take over, there's another line in the script. The violent chapters of our past don't have to dictate the ending. They can be the prologue to something softer, stronger, more deliberate. We'll always carry our history with us. The blood, the battles, the betrayals, they're part of the clay. 2. They give it grit, texture, strength. But they don't have to be the only pattern. We can decide that the next layer will be smoother, that the next hands to hold this clay will feel possibility, not inevitability. And when the day comes that our piece of the work is fired in the kiln, when the clay hardens and our part of the shaping is done, maybe it will stand as something worth passing on. Not perfect, not flawless, but better than it was when we found it. The clay is still wet. The choice is still ours. And for the first time in a long time, we can see the shape we could make if we have the will to try with the clay while we still can, before it hardens into a shape no one wanted. It means looking past the next quarter, the next election, the next news cycle, and asking what shape you want to leave for the hands that come after yours. There's a personal version of this, too. In your own life, the clay is still wet. You can still change how you handle conflict. You can still choose to build instead of break, to listen instead of lash out. You can still repair relationships that have been dented, still create something new from pieces you thought were ruined. And here's the thing, choosing peace in your own life doesn't just make your days quieter. It ripples outward. The men you mentor, the families you raise, the people who watch how you handle a challenge, they carry that example forward. The clay in their hands takes a slightly different shape because of yours. If enough people do that, the shape of the world shifts. Not overnight, not in a way that makes headlines, but steadily.